Good morning. I'm starting from the Rebbe's book, Selections from Lekutei Sichot, the first talk of on Vayakhel. This week we combined two portions, Vayakhel and Pekudei. The first portion tells us all the instructions that Moshe is sharing with the Jewish people. And Pekudei, they give us an accounting of how much possession he collected, different material, gold, silver, copper, wood, tapestries, wool, etc., and what they used it for, and how they actually built it. So how many portions are dedicated to the temple? There are 4. Teruma, where God speaks to Moshe. Tetzaveh, he gives a more specific. So those two are dedicated between Moshe and God. And then 2 portions this week is between Moshe and the Jewish people. Moshe is instructing the Jewish people all that God had commanded him, and actually what happened. At the beginning of this week's Torah portion, the Torah reads the following. Moshe gathered the entire Jewish people at Kol Adad Bnei Israel, all of the Jewish people. Vayomer Alehem, he tells them, keep the Shabbat, do not ignite fire on Shabbat. Immediately they continue. Vayomer Moshe spoke El Kol Adad Bnei Israel, to the entire Jewish congregation. These are the words that God had commanded, saying, and I'm reading verse 5, chapter 35. Collect from among yourself a contribution offering for God, every person whose heart inspires him to generosity should bring the following contribution for God. Every person whose heart inspires him must give. Ask the Rebbe, the first is a contradiction between the 2 parts of the verse. At the beginning, the text reads, collect from among yourself a contribution offering. What does collect mean? Against the will. There is a rule that everybody, khu meitam. In Hebrew, it's a very strict word. Khu means take it against the will if they refuse to give. The second part is kol nediv libo, everyone whose heart desire, yevi'eh, let him bring it. It doesn't make sense. Is it about forcing someone to give, or allowing people the chance to do on their own volition? Says the Medrash, to do more, says the Medrash, that it talks about 2 separate contributions. The first part talks about beka lagulgolet, a coin for each head, which was used for the public sacrifices, and in that way everyone is equal. I cannot give 2, I cannot give half, I must give 1 per person. The second half is talking kol nediv libo, the actual construction of the temple. Everybody gives as much as they want.
1 per person and 1 per family household.
I believe 1 per person.
Which people in the house, you give 50.
That's the ad valorem tax.
Right.
Hey,
What are you accounting? What are you going to do? Right.
First question the Rebbe is asking. Go back to Parshas Truma, where God is telling Moshe what to tell the Jewish people. You will not find any voluntarily contribution. The whole text reads, K'chu meitchem ve'ikchu li truma. Let them take for me a contribution. Meit kol ish asher yidvenu lebo, anyone whose heart's desire, tikchu et trumati. You must take the contribution. Vezot hatruma asher tikchu meitam. It's all about taking forcefully. No contribution by its own, on its own volition. Where did Moshe come up with the idea to give a contribution? Rashi in Teruma tells us that there is a hint to it in the portion of Teruma that there is actually 3 types of contributions. Now we're learning about 3. 2 are mandatory, ad valorem, and 1 is voluntarily. The first 2 is half a shekel. The half a shekel was for the foundation, adanim of the sockets that held the beams of the walls of the Mishkan. That was mandatory for every Jew. Then the second one, which is mandatory, is for public sacrifices, beka lagulgolet, which is the same amount, I believe, a half a shekel. Then you have a third one, which is voluntarily, let them do gold, silver, copper, crimson wool, or whatever they want. But, says the Rebbe, many times we read about God's commandment to Moshe, and then when Moshe shares with the Jewish people, there is a change. And we know that Moshe did not say anything on his own. It's a foundation in Judaism. But every time it requires an explanation. Why we don't read about the third contribution in Teruma? In addition, most importantly, says Rabbi, this construction, this project is so detailed in 4 portions dedicated. If you talk to me about a commandment and you say God spoke in a very concise way and Moshe detailed it, sometimes it also requires explanation. Here you're talking about 4 portions, 2 portions dedicated for God's instruction to Moshe, 2 portions dedicated for Moshe. How come this contribution, which similarly is the most important one because it comes to the construction of the temple, it doesn't mention in Teruma? Why is there a distinction between Teruma, where it's all mandatory, and it's talking about 2 contributions are mandatory, one for the sockets to hold the beams, and the other is for public sacrifices that must be coming as with the equal participation of every Jew. When the third one, called Nediv Libo Yevi'eh, bringing on his own volition, only appears in Vayakhel. So either one, if you're talking about a separate contribution, mention that in Teruma as well. Yes, Harry.
The Jews were super rich going out of Egypt. They all have money. Why would they be forced to take out half a shekel, which is nothing?
We call it a klotz kasha.
Because I mean, they take from them.
Do you realize that the fact that people possess wealth is not an indication that they are generous? Do you know that, right?
Yeah, but half a shekel.
Do you know how many people, when I grew up in the 70s in Israel, people who would stand on the street like homeless collecting, and they discovered when they died childless, they had no family. Their homes were loaded with buckets of coins, that they were one of the wealthiest people in Tel Aviv at the time. How many times I remember seeing a photo, the newspaper put around a front page photo of the buckets, the 5-gallon buckets loaded with coins. The guy had a disease. It's an ailment. So the fact that people are wealthy is not an indication that they're going. And you know what? I'll circle back to it later on with another layer, deeper layer on top of the explanation. We'll come back and see how it plays out. Did you understand the question? Did you understand the question? A simple question. I'll repeat. I know you hate it, but Vayakhel adds more to what God instructed Moshe. Kol nediv libo yavieh, anyone whose heart's desire should bring, which is a contradiction to the first part, and it tells us that there was another category of contribution, which is voluntarily. Says the Rebbe, okay, makes sense, but why Moshe wasn't told by God? Why it's not there? And many times God tells, we read different between Moshe's instruction to the Jewish people versus what he got. But here we're talking about, first, it needs an explanation. Why? Second, here, there's so many details are enumerated that this is an important detail. It's a category of contribution that actually occupies the entire 2 portions of Vayakhel-Pekudei. There is another distinction. Read over here in Teruma, God says to Moshe, Daber el Bnei Israel, speak to the Israelites, right? In Vayakhel, it says, Daber Vayakhel Moshe et kol. You know what kol means? All. What do you mean et kol? God speaks to Moshe, says, talk to the Jewish people. Here, Vayakhel et Moshe et kol adat Bnei Israel. And I share with you, it wasn't just about Shabbat, because right after he's talking about Shabbat, the Torah repeats again, which requires an explanation, but the Torah repeats, Vayomer Moshe el kol adad bnei, Vayomer Moshe el kol adad bnei Yisrael lemor ze hadavar. This is the word. Why call? What happened that he's talking to everybody? Everybody means men, women, and children. Bnei Israel means men. Why is there a change? Says the Rebbe that on a simple layer, here he's talking to the men in charge, those who the collectors, the representatives. So the tax collectors, that's where he speaks. Here, when he talks about the third contribution, which is the heart's desire, he's talking to everybody, including women and children, because they can also participate. Okay, makes sense, Ali? But again, we need to understand what happened between Truma and Vayakhel. Here is the Rebbe's explanation, and please realize that it will accommodate another layer, much deeper Kabbalistic layer. Says the Rebbe, do you know that there is something major happened between Teruma and Vayakhel, between God instructing Moshe versus the actual commanding the Jewish people? What happened in between? The golden calf, the sin of the golden calf. That's why the Mishkan is called over here in this week's portion, Vayakhel-Pekudei, in the portion of Pekudei, a Mishkan. This is the accounting of Mishkan. Mishkan Edut. Edut is testimony. Ed is a witness. This is a testimony that God atoned, forgave the Jewish people for the golden calf, and he's going to rest among them. So what happened? Here God is telling him about building of the construction of the Mishkan. In the portion of Vayakhel, in between we have the story of the golden calf. They already seen the golden calf. They asked for atonement. The first 40 days God refused. Another second set of 40 days, Moshe pleading God, and God says to him, yes, okay, I've atoned. After Yom Kippur, Moshe comes down and says, okay, now it's time for you to build the Mishkan. There are differences of opinions. When was the instruction, when is the commandment given? But according to majority of opinions, it was given after the golden calf as an atonement for the golden calf. Says the Rebbe, why is part of the atonement, the proof that God atoned for the golden calf is the construction of the Mishkan, is to show that instead of volunteer their gold and assets for the golden calf, they will volunteer their gold for God's temple. So they take, we call it measure for measure. They take their assets, their wealth that they used for a sin, idol worship, and now they will dedicate it for a mitzvah to build a house for God. When can it be reflected to the deepest layer is when you are offered the opportunity to give without having been forced to. In other words, to show that God is atones and they are asking for atonement, it's not sufficient to give a half a shekel that is mandatory. Because it's mandatory, perhaps you do it because you're afraid of the lashes, because they're going to take it out of your bank account regardless. But when you are offered to give on your own volition, now you go and do it in a very unique way, as we'll discover in a moment. That's a sign that God, you want atonement from God wholeheartedly. Where is it reflected that they care for an atonement? There are two ways. There are many ways, but there are two that I'm going to share. Number one, their quickness. Do you know how long it took to the construction of the temple? About 2 weeks. 2 weeks. They were given they started the collecting the first day of Sukkot, 2 days after Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, God came and says, Salachti kidvarecha, atone, and God commanded them of the 2 days later, he gives them the construction. It says day or two, 2 days after, 3 days after Yom Kippur, they started. How long did it take them? Berosh Chodesh Kislev, the first of Kislev, which is, I'm sorry, it's not 2 weeks, 6 weeks. It took them 6 weeks to put such an instruction. There was no machines, there was no electricity, there was no the drills. It was an immense project, and yet they were able to put everything together in 6 weeks, which is unbelievable. The reason is because by the golden calf, if you read over there, they are going over after Aaron right away, and he has to push them and say, wait till tomorrow. And in the morning, they get up early in the morning. Here we are, let's do it. The hastening of the scene had to be measure for measure the hastening of the building of the Mishkan. Even though God did not allow them to actual construction until the 1st of Nisan, 3 months. Kislev, Tevet, Shvat, Adar, 4 months. He said, put it aside in storage, only the 1st of Nisan, because it's the month Yitzchak was born and he was the first sacrifice. Therefore, we're going to put it together on the 1st of Nisan. But the actual material, woods, the walls, the menorah, everything was done within 6 weeks, which is unbelievable. Why were they doing it quick? They could have taken their time. But because it came to atone for the golden calf, they had to demonstrate that they're doing it with haste. Now, another part of the Mishkan is that they gave so much that they had to tell Moshe, we have too much. It's never happened before or after that a campaign within the Jewish people had sufficient. There's always not enough.
Yeah, I've never heard you complain that you got too much money.
You will never hear that from a rabbi. Just a minute. So this is the second. The first is doing it so quick. The second is that they had plenty. Why? Because people are jumping to give as much as they can to atone for the golden calf. Says the Rebbe, in Teruma, he's talking to the officers in charge, to the collectors. So Daber el Adat Israel, only those men. Here, Vayakhel Moshe, he needs atonement for every Jew. Call Adat Israel, men and women and children, and now he's going to give them an opportunity to achieve atonement. That opportunity can be expressed only with the third type of category, or the second category, the third type of contribution, where it's done voluntarily, and that's when you show it. Did you understand so far? I want to go one layer farther than that. Yes, Harry.
The women didn't contribute to the golden calf.
Right. Against it, they refused.
Right. And number two, the reason why the Mishkan was...
That's why, if you allow me to get to the second layer, it will address this in specific.
Also, we're able to put up the Mishkan because God showed Moshe how it should look. They had no idea. They had no blueprints. He showed them in a picture or whatever the tzara or whoever it was, showed them how things should be.
Harry, in today's world, with all of God's instructions, it would have taken at least 2 years.
No, I agree, but I'm saying that they knew how to do it because they were shown images of it.
But they've never done anything like it before. The breastplates,
they were the first time.
they were not diamond dealers. They were tree cutters, or it was impossible to explain. Especially, you need to imagine how it looks before you start the project. They never had, they never seen something similar. There's no doubt that 6 weeks. Says the Rebbe, that explains another component. Before I get to another layer, a much deeper layer, here is one more point. That explains that part and parcel of the actual Mishkan tabernacle must be done voluntarily and not mandatory. Why? Says the Rebbe, if it's mandatory, it comes, and you have to get used to the idea, from above to below. In other words, someone is forcing it upon you. Anytime somebody forces something on you, it's temporary. As soon as they stop forcing it on you, you go back to your previous state. When you want to achieve change, a real change must come from below. Where do we see that? God came down 40 days earlier, or at 120 days earlier, God came down on Mount Sinai. What happened? God revealed himself, the greatest connection to God. But as soon as God departed this mountain, the Jews went back and they worship idols. It was temporary, because whenever it comes from above, it's not achieving a complete change. That's reflected in the Mount Sinai itself. It says, as soon as God departed, Mount Sinai turned back to a regular mountain. While God was there, it's a holy site. No one touches it, no one come close. But what happened after God departed? It says that Mount Sinai turned back to a regular mountain. In other words, the holiness was temporarily. Mishkan, on the other hand, they needed to have a permanent change that will connect them to God, an everlasting. How do you do that? Offering to volunteer on your own volition to assist with the construction. By doing so, you put your heart and soul, and it will have a permanent change. That's why the holiness of the Mishkan was forever. It did not last temporarily. Did you understand? So therefore, the actual construction from the three contribution, which one is the most powerful? The third one, the voluntary one. In Teruma, before the golden calf, he's talking about only those two that are mandatory. Here, when he wants to A, atone for the golden calf, B, make sure it's permanent, he's introducing kol nediv libo, anyone whose heart's desire should bring, not to take from them. Let them do what they want. Says the Rebbe, now I'm going one layer deeper that will address some of Harry's questions or comments. What's the difference between the first Teruma and Vayakhel? You know what the difference? The women. In Teruma, he's talking to Bnei Israel, et kol ish, it says from every man. It says in the text, only men. We say that it's applied to the Gizbarim, to the officers in charge. Here, daber el kol Bnei Israel, it refers to all. What's the change? Now women are involved. Says, and the children. Says the Rebbe, actually we see that the Torah tells us that the women's contribution was far greater than the men. Vayavo, later we read in the verse, Vayavo anashim al anashim, right? Remember that? Men were secondary to women. The women came first, and the contribution far exceeded those of men. We know, anybody who's in fundraising will tell you that women will give a lot more than men. And the reason is because they are very kind-hearted. They're very generous. Just a minute. Therefore, the men were secondary. The women slept. It's the way when I was raised, when I used to read this verse, the women told their husband, come on, get up, we're going to give a contribution. He says, I'm tired. I don't care, you're tired, you're coming. She already had the checkbook, she already had the jewelry. And he's kind of cleaning his eyes to see what's going on. And she's already writing a check. Give me your savings account. She's writing another check. Give me your foundation. She's writing a third check. Here's my bracelet. Here's my earrings. And then she turned to him and says, what's left? Open up your wallet. Give me all the Benjamins. The women, just a minute, the women were superior to the men. The Torah describes it. The Rebbe points out there are many other aspects where the women were much greater. A, they gave their own jewelry. Men were stingy. That addresses your point.
Copper.
In addition, they gave their mirror. And God says, Chaviv alai min hakol. The mirrors they gave is more cherished by me than anything else. And the third, Kol isha chochmat lev tavu et ha'ezim. They had a very smart, very specific, unusual wisdom to, what do you call it? Fun? Or what? To weave, to spun. They spun the wool on the, not chashim, tzemer. They spun the wool on the back of the sheep themselves, which was unbelievable. We don't know how to do it. Well, you have to take it off. They were able to do it, so it's an animal, a living animal contribution, not something that's already dead. In other words, their contribution way ahead for men. Men were stingy, even though they had big loaded bank accounts and lots of donkeys loaded with jewelry. They were stingy. And second, they gave them mirrors and their jewelry. And third, they spun the wool on the animals. So we see that their contribution is a much deeper than, much greater, far exceeded than men. That's this week, says the Rebbe. You know why? The Chabad, the Zohar, and by the way, if you have time, if you give me, I'll share another part of Zohar that the Rebbe is addressing. Says the Zohar, it's in Kabbalah, Shema Beni, King Solomon said, Shema Beni Musar Avicha, listen, my son, to the rebuke of your father, Ve'al titosh, and do not forsaken Torat Imecha, the Torah of your mother. The Gemara says that the written Torah is compared to a father. The oral Torah is referred to a mother. What's the difference between a father and a mother? Father we call in Hebrew mashpia, a giver. Mother is a mekabel, a recipient, a receiver. In the natural way of order, when people get married, in the physical aspect of intimacy, the father gives and the mother receives. Says the Rebbe, the written Torah is like a father, he gives. That's why we don't have much wiggle room in the written Torah. There is not much you can do. God gave us the Torah, you have to study it. It's like receiving something from the Father. The Jewish people, Knesset Israel, the Jewish community, the Jewish congregation, is a recipient from God. Where are they reflecting their assets? Where do they express themselves more? In the oral Torah. Oral Torah is Torah Timecha. Why is it like a mother? Because here you have the study to reveal, God gave us tools to mine the Torah. It's mining tools, 13 principles, where we go le'apashala. Le'apashala means to reveal more and more. As generations go by, we reveal much, much more that we didn't have before. You have the Tanaim, you have Amoraim, you have Rashi, you have Tosfot, you have Rishonim, Achonim. There is always new layers we discover. One can ask, what do you mean? They didn't have it before? The answer is no, because we keep mining, digging deeper, 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 on top, like a midget on top of a giant, of the shoulders of a giant. So after the revelation of the giant, the midget is able to reach a little farther. That's only in the oral Torah. The written Torah, there is no change, because it's the father. The mother is represent the recipient. What's unique about the recipient? The oral Torah, where we come and reveal more and more and more. Says the Rebbe, that's the idea of women. That's why in the Mishkan, you need to include the women suddenly, where in the Ruma there was no women. And the reason is because their connection to God is a steady, permanent one. For a father, the father, Torah Avicha, the written Torah, it's so straightforward. There is no wiggle room. There is no change. In other words, the connection to me, my brains, my emotions, is very limited. That's why, as we discover when God gave us the Torah, the Ten Commandments, it didn't last that long. The Mishkan represents my contribution to the relationship, like the mother, and therefore we'll receive the oral Torah to reveal more and more aspects of the Torah that was never there before. Now it's become my revelation. I get my name to be attached in the Talmud. Every time a rabbi is teaching something, you have his name, and it's very, very crucial to be to attach to this. That's the idea of a Mishkan. In other words, the Mishkan expresses the femininity of the Knesset Israel, of the Jewish congregation. And therefore, we needed the women. And that's why who gave more? Who gave much to a much deeper type of bonding with the Mishkan? The women, not the men. That gives me one more. That explains, the Zohar says, Vayakhel, the first word is Vayakhel, right? Vayakhel means he gathered. Comes the Zohar and says, here, when he gathered the Jewish people, it's not only the men, it's also the women and children. Ask the Rebbe, I don't understand. When Moshe gathered the Jewish people on Mount Sinai, the word Vayakhel does not appear, and yet you know that the women and children are included. Why the Zohar is mentioning women here? In addition, says the Rebbe, every time we say there are 600,000 men, standing by the foot of Mount Sinai. You think it's only the men? It's not only the men. It's men, women, and children, because each man is only half with the spouse. And even those who are not married, much past the age of 20 to 60 or earlier than 20 are included. When we say 600,000 men stood by the foot of Mount Sinai, it wasn't just 600,000, it was everybody. They are represented through the 600,000. Why here the Zohar says that Vayakhel here was men, women, and children? Says Rabbi, now we can understand. The Torah now is talking about a third contribution. That contribution is reflected more through the female than the male. Therefore, the Zohar comes and says, you know what it means Vayakhel? Men, women, and children. Now we can understand why the women are taking front row here in many aspects. As I mentioned, A, they bought much more than the men. B, they bought the mirrors, as the Torah is enumerating in this week again and again about the mirror a second time. And number 3, they spun the wool on the goats and on the sheep while they were still alive to show that they have contributed not just financially, but with their heart to make it the best it's possible because it stays fresh. The dyeing of it is a much higher quality. And it is to bring the glory of God in the Mishkan. All that was done to atone for the golden calf. The atonement is achieved when the Jew comes on his own volition and contributes, which is the idea of femininity. We, the recipient, stand up and say, here, this is my part. That's will have a permanent standing. I hope I covered the topic. Thank you very much. Good Shabbos, everybody.